Welcome everyone. So great to see you all. Lovely to see your faces. Please come on in and get ready for a great discussion today. Thank you so much for joining. I'm DeQuendra Bertrand. I'm Communications Director at the Aurora Institute. And I'll be facilitating today's webinar with our esteemed panel. I'm so excited for this session because it's so important for the field. A few things you should know. Today's webinar is a part of a larger series of webinars that are leading up to our first ever virtual symposium in late October. And we will have another set of webinars following the symposium. So we are calling these our all fall webinar series. Today's webinar is a part of a special subset of these webinars that are focused on research. They're all aimed at building the evidence base for personalized learning. I encourage you to visit our website, aurora-institute.org, click on Learn and Network, and you can find out a lot more about all of the sessions that we'll be hosting this fall. So as we get settled in and get ready for today's discussion, I'm encouraging everyone to please use the chat box to introduce yourselves, to please tell us your name, your organization, your location, and then how about a few words to describe your thoughts, your hopes, your dreams for the coming school year. It's a very interesting time for us, so we'd love to see your thoughts about what you hope to achieve in the coming year. Please know that today's conversation, throughout today's conversation, you are welcome to use the chat box at any time to ask questions, to answer questions, to share your thoughts, your insights. Here at the Aurora Institute, we highly prize democratizing knowledge, so we always encourage our webinars attendees to share your knowledge, your insights, and what you're learning on these webinars on social media. So if you please, on Twitter, use the hashtag Aurora 2020 and mention our handle. And also know that we are recording this session and we will make it available to you after the call today. So let's dive in. Please, let's give a warm welcome to our panelists. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Erica Bauer, Director of Community Relations at the Chicago Bulls, Alex Fralin, CEO and founder of Leading Partnerships, Nia Ennis, a student at Walter Payton College Prep High School. Very excited to hear from you today. And Dr. Dave Ponescu, Executive Director and co-founder at PERTS at Stanford University. And with that, I am going to turn things over to Dave.
Great, thank you so much, DeQuendra. Again, I'm Dave Ponescu, and I'm the Executive Director of PERTS. And we're a nonprofit institute that helps schools use evidence-based strategies and measures to improve student outcomes systematically and equitably. Generally, we do that by creating free technology-enabled tools and by partnering with outstanding educators to pilot and improve those tools so their impact grows and extends over time. So I'm very excited today to be joined by two of my favorite practitioner partners, Erica and Alex, and also by Nia, who is a high school student at the school where Erica, until very recently, was an administrator. Each of them will kind of tell you a little bit more about the context of our partnership later on during their remarks. So today's session is really all about the role of student experience in educational equity and excellence. The role of student experience in learning is often missing from conversations in education circles. We tend to focus kind of narrowly on the content students need to learn and on whether or not they've actually learned that content. And we tend to focus a lot less on how students are actually experiencing the system and that content, what their learning experiences are. Nor do we focus as much on how those experiences might differ in systematic ways, in ways that systematically privilege and engage some groups of students, while systematically disadvantaging and disengaging other groups of students. And I think an implication here is that to create an excellent and equitable education system, we must broaden our scope beyond the content to be learned. We need to recognize that the learning experiences educators create for their students really profoundly affect whether students choose to engage with content, and also whether they're even able cognitively to engage with that content in the deep way they need to in order to be able to learn. So decades of research from cognitive science, from psychological science and neuroscience show that students can only learn when they're motivated to focus their attention, right? Learning is a very effortful process. So we can only learn when we're motivated to focus our attention and when we're actually fully able to focus our attention. And that's kind of obvious to most educators, right? We know that students don't learn if they're distracted or disengaged. No one's ever learned algebra by sleeping on an algebra book, right? As much as we might have wanted to. But what gets ignored too often is why students do or don't engage. And that's really important because until we understand why our students are engaging or disengaging, or perhaps why they're trying to engage and not able to engage effectively, it's almost impossible to support their engagement in an effective and equitable way. And that's really where student experience comes in. So research shows that a variety of experiences shape students' motivation and ability to learn. For example, students are much more likely to engage and to learn effectively when they experience strong relationships with their teachers, when they feel seen and valued in the learning environment, and when they understand the relevance of the work they're doing. Furthermore, research also shows that our education system is less likely to afford those kinds of engaging learning experiences to students of color and to students from other marginalized backgrounds. So in today's session, my co-presenters and I will start to answer two questions. First, what kinds of experiences help students engage and develop as learners? And second, what resources and approaches can educators use to systematically and equitably ensure that all of their students are afforded the kinds of positive developmental experiences that will help them engage and thrive as learners and as people? So I'll start in my remarks by introducing some research examples and tools. And I'll just know that a lot of these are all free tools that are available online right now. You can start going and exploring them right after the session's over. And then Alex and Erica and Nia will provide some additional examples and approaches from their own experiences. Okay, so next slide, please. So the first example that I'll share has to do with critical feedback. So we know that feedback, is really essential for learning. It's really hard for students to learn effectively and to figure out, what they have, what they understand, what they don't understand, unless if they get feedback from their teachers or from other students. But even though feedback is really important for learning, some feedback seems to have a more positive effect than other feedback. So I'd like you to take a moment to think about some feedback you've received. Think about a time when critical feedback really supported you to improve, really helped you lean into that feedback and motivated you to get better. When you've taken a moment to think about that, please go ahead and share your response in the chat. So Susan asked how I define feedback. So I suppose when someone gives you suggestions for improvement, might be one way of defining feedback for the purposes of this question. So it tells you things that you did wrong or things that you could do better. I'm hearing a lot of relevance, timeliness, the relationship between you and the person providing feedback, really knowing that that person valued you and valued your perspective. Yep, when my boss gave me feedback while telling me it was because she cared about me. Yeah, great. Thank you all for sharing. So can I go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So, feedback can be a really tricky thing. A lot of the time, the intent behind the feedback can be ambiguous, and it can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. So if from the perspective of a student, when we're getting critical feedback from our teacher, does our teacher intend to support us, to reach a high standard because they believe in us and because they care for us? Is that why they're giving us feedback? Or is the teacher signaling that we're not good at this, that we don't have what it takes to be successful, those are really profoundly different interpretations of what could potentially be the same feedback. And I think that latter interpretation, that negative interpretation, is captured well in the words of this student. So the student says, my essays in this class are always criticized, and my teacher says they're not good enough. It makes me feel like the teacher doesn't like me, and I can't ever be good enough. So take a moment to put yourself in the shoes of this student. Why would you ever try hard at essay writing if you believe that you can't ever be good enough, right? It's tremendously demoralizing. Or if you were convinced that your teacher really doesn't like you and doesn't believe in you, such that even if you did get better, they probably wouldn't grade you fairly and give you a fair shot. So even if you did improve, you still wouldn't get graded better, right? That would be really demoralizing and might really get in the way of choosing to revise one's work. So could I go to the next slide, please? So my colleague David Yeager and some of his collaborators decided to put this idea to the test in a randomized controlled study. They had English teachers give their students real critical feedback on an actual essay in their class. So this is like, they marked up students' papers. Then they also had the teachers write 2 different versions of feedback framing on these little Post-it notes. So one kind of a note was a neutral placebo. It just said, I'm giving you these comments so you have feedback on your essay. The other kind of note was intended to make explicit what otherwise might be implicit. It was intended to make explicit the positive intent behind the feedback. It said, I'm giving you these comments because I have high standards and I know that you can meet them. It was intended to remove any ambiguity that might exist about the intent behind that feedback. Then the researchers randomly put these different notes on different students' papers. And they never told teachers. The teachers never knew which student got which feedback. So that, in other words, teachers were blinded to which conditions students were in. Okay, so can we go on to the next slide, please? So when students were given the opportunity to revise their essays later on, the effects of these seemingly simple notes were pretty astounding. So it turned out that all students were more likely to revise their essays when the notes they got were framed the feedback as feedback for growth. In other words, when they got the note that expressed the idea that the teacher has high standards and that they're sure that that student can meet those high standards, and that's why they're giving them the feedback, right? So I believe in you. I know you can reach the standard. That's why I'm giving this feedback. So all students were more likely to revise their essays. That's what these graphs show. But this effect is especially large for Black students in the study. Now, keep in mind, Black students are constantly bombarded with negative stereotypes and messages about their academic abilities, and they're frequently treated in really biased ways. So when the intent behind feedback is ambiguous, and it usually is, Black students have a really good reason to doubt the intent of the feedback is positive. So when Black students got notes that made explicit the positive intent, when they removed that ambiguity and really made clear that that teacher really does believe in them and that feedback is intended to help them grow and build that trust, students were over 4 times more likely to revise their essays. Instead of 17% of them revising their essays like in the control condition, a full 72% revised their essays when the notes invoked high standards and assurance that those students could meet those standards. Now, notably, many of those students also started to express greater trust in that teacher, right? So these notes actually built trust because they signaled to the students that their teacher really cares about them and that this critical feedback that otherwise might seem like a negative thing was actually a positive thing. There was an expression of authentic care. And over the rest of the semester, the students did higher quality work. They actually earned higher, the students who were assigned to that high quality feedback earned higher semester grades over the rest of the entire semester. Now, again, I want to stress that all the content, right? All the content was the same. The feedback was equally specific. It was equally timely. What changed was how students experienced that feedback and the relationship with their teacher. Those improved experiences, that changed interpretation because the teacher signaled something different. They signaled care. They signaled what, this positive intent for the feedback. Made a really big impact. and those different experiences translated into higher and more equitable learning outcomes. Now, I want to call something out here. It would be really easy to assume that it doesn't matter how feedback is framed. In fact, we often assume that, right? We often don't take the time to clarify what do we intend with the kind of feedback we provide. It would also be easy to assume that students already know, well, why would I be giving you feedback if I didn't believe in you? But the reality is students don't know that. A lot of the time students, we shouldn't make that assumption because students don't know that a lot of the time, as the study makes clear. So we should really stop making those assumptions and start learning what our students are actually experiencing and how those experiences are affecting their ability to engage and to learn. So in a little bit, I'll share some free tools that you can use to figure out what your students are experiencing and how to improve those experiences in a systematic way. But first, I'll introduce a different kind of experience that supports engagement and learning. Whether one sees oneself, one's culture and community represented and affirmed in the curriculum. So, and I'll start with a quote from a student. Could I go to slide 9, please? So here's a quote from Isaac Nieblas. So Isaac says, learning about the Chicano Revolution in the 1960s made me feel as though my concerns, my issues, my humanity were legitimate. I felt more enthused and I was having more conversations because I knew that my people were just as smart as anyone else. Having that understanding revamped my perception of who I am, of who I was as a person and as an intellectual being. So to paraphrase Isaac here, until Isaac learned about the Chicano Revolution pretty late in his schooling, he felt like his concerns, his issues, his humanity were not legitimate. His culture and his community were entirely absent from the curriculum, giving the impression that he wasn't smart or valued by the school system. When his school finally gave him the chance to explore and affirm his cultural background, it, in his own words, revamped his perception of who he is as a person and as an intellectual being. Now, I recognize that the value of this kind of cultural affirmation may seem surprising or overstated to some of you. And that might be the case because you've never felt culturally marginalized in your school or in its curriculum, or perhaps because you never got the chance to experience what it's like to be culturally affirmed. So let me share the results of 2 really rigorous evaluations of well-run ethnic studies programs. Could I go to the next slide, please? So when Tom D. and Emily Penner of Stanford University evaluated the impact of San Francisco Unified's 9th grade ethnic studies program, they found that the students who were assigned to this program had attendance rates that were 21 percentage points higher than those not assigned to the program, right? So there's a huge increase in attendance for ninth graders. Those students also earned GPAs, overall GPAs, that were 1.4 grade points higher. So that's like 1.5 letter grades more. And I want to stress that was excluding that class. So it wasn't just a case that they got better grades in that class. This is actually excluding that class. Those students did so much better in all their other classes. In other words, that one class changed how students' relationship with their school in a way that helped them engage more effectively in all of their other classes. When Dee and Penner evaluated the impact of a different program, the Kingmakers of Oakland, which is a culturally affirming program designed specifically for Black male students, they found that the program reduced high school dropout by 43%. Now, I think the impact of these programs is pretty astounding. And I would be remiss to not point something out here. So these programs are designed to provide cultural visibility and affirmation to Black and brown students. And that affirmation is something that white students get pretty much every day in history and ELA class. So it's not the case the Black and brown students need something extra the white students aren't getting. It's quite the opposite. The reality is that they need to have the same experience of cultural affirmation that our system has systematically been providing to white students and systematically denying to students of color. So could we please skip to slide 12? Great, thank you. So in my 10 years of collaborating with educators to put these kinds of ideas and insights into practice, I've come to appreciate how important it is for educators to have concrete examples of what kinds of experiences their students should be having, as well as simple ways to measure and improve these experiences. So in partnership with Camille Farrington, Carol Dweck, Jason Okonafor, and many others, we've identified 6 learning conditions that we think every student should experience in class. We've also developed a brief set of questions that educators can use to understand what their students are experiencing, and also whether there are disparities in these experiences as a function of race, class, gender, or other characteristics. For example, we think it's important for educators to be able to learn at what rate their white and Black students agree with statements like, in this class, I've learned new things about my culture and their community. Or I feel like my teacher's glad that I'm in their class. Often there are the disparities in these experiences, and that matters a lot for engagement. So we know from research that each of these learning conditions is important for students to engage and succeed. And we also know that unless students ask their students, they have no way to know whether or not they're actually helping create these experiences for their students. Now, that would be true, that it would be really hard for teachers to know this even in face-to-face instruction, but it's especially challenging and important to know that now, to know what students are experiencing now. And that's because of the explosive combination of a pandemic, distance learning, and really significant social unrest. That's why we need to really learn from students what they're experiencing, and to really be intentional about making sure that we're creating the right kinds of experiences for them that will help them succeed. So can you please skip to slide 15? Great, thank you. So over the last 3 years, my colleagues and I have been working with lots of different researchers and with educators around the country to create a process that helps educators get really systematic about understanding and improving students' experiences. And I want to stress any 6th to 12th grade teacher can use this process, and the accompanying tool is completely for free because of the sponsorship of multiple foundations and the essentially volunteer work and partnership from lots of incredible educators. So let me just walk you through this process. And I'm gonna do so in part just so you can kind of understand that, and also because even if you don't use these tools, I think this is a good kind of general kind of process to think about and try to follow. So this process starts with a 5 to 10 minute student survey. And that survey is intended to shed light on the way students are experiencing each of the 6 learning conditions that I showed you on the previous slide. The second step is for teachers to review students' feedback and to discuss it with their students. Now, I want to really stress here that it's really essential for students to feel heard and to be authentic partners in creating a more engaging learning environment, right? This can't just be a survey that, gets, it's like, oh, I survey my students and then I never paid attention to it, right? It's really important to engage with students for that survey to be the starting point, not the ending point of this transformation in student experience. So then the third step, the second step is for the students to review students' feedback and discuss it with their students. And the third step is for teachers to access a library of teacher-tested strategies that are relevant to improving each of these learning conditions. These strategies provide concrete starting points for improving students' learning experiences. These strategies in this library has been growing over time as we work with more and more teachers to figure out what works for them for actually improving these different learning conditions. But it's really important to stress here that the teachers usually need to iterate on these practices to figure out what works for them and what works for their students. And that's why the fourth step in this process essentially is to repeat the process, right? To rerun the survey, to re-engage students, and to really be in a constant state of continuous improvement and iteration to really figure out what works for you and for your students, to really be systematic about creating the kind of culture and the kind of experiences that bring out the best in all students. So I'll just show you a couple of kind of quick screenshots of some of the kinds of things that you might encounter if you were to use this particular program. So we go to slide 16, please. So here's an example of the kind of graph a teacher would see soon after surveying their students, right? So it would show the % of students who agreed with a statement. This week in class, I got specific suggestions about how to improve my skills, right? This is kind of connecting back to the feedback study that I shared at the beginning of the session today. And crucially, these data get disaggregated as a function of race, gender, and any other grouping characteristic that the teacher might be interested in, right? So if they're interested in ELL students or any other group of students, they can separately disaggregate data for that group of students. Often that's relevant if there's a particular equity challenge at a school that a teacher wants to tackle. And importantly, and I forgot to include the chart for this, but those data also get showed over time, so the teachers can actually see whether those experiences are actually getting better. That's really important, right? We don't want to just, we don't just want to assume best. We really want to re-engage students and make sure that we're actually making progress. Could I go to the next slide, please? Great. And then again, a really essential part of this is to provide some really concrete strategies to help teachers get started on changing these experiences and improving them. So for example, if a teacher found that students' experiences weren't as good or as equitable as they want, they would consult a library of relevant strategies to learn how to improve those experiences. And for example, here are some screenshots from a learning module that highlights strategies relevant to giving high quality critical feedback. It might look familiar because some of the research and approaches, it's highlighting some of the research and approaches that I shared earlier on, but in much greater depth and with a bigger focus on practical applications for the actual classroom. Can we go to slide 18, please? Okay, great. So last but not least, I want to acknowledge the many incredible partners we have in this work. These free resources are always improving because of the support from our funders, and also especially because of the incredible contributions of our educator partners. So with that, I'll turn it over to one of those partners. Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Dave, and good afternoon, everyone. Alex Freyland here. If you could go back one slide, that would be helpful. Thank you. I joined I became a member of the National Equity Project's team to support these 7 districts who had made a commitment to addressing a specific student-driven equity challenge in their district. These 7 districts were part of a cohort in NEP's 25 years of working. The first time they put together a cohort of districts who were working and learning together to disrupt patterns that they were seeing within their district to improve a specific system that was not working for students. So I was proud to work with 3 of the districts in this particular team. These districts committed to a 2-year journey to create and develop cross-functional teams that include the superintendent, central office staff, principals, teachers, and most importantly, students. Some teams even invited board members for the specific purpose of understanding their challenges and then redesigning their systems to address a specific student-centered equity challenge. And we were proud to work alongside Dave and the PERTS team to support these districts, including other partners to accelerate and deepen their work towards building equitable systems for students. We had a network aspiration, if you could take me to the next slide. And I'm gonna ask Nia, our fabulous student, if you wouldn't mind reading our network aspiration.
All right, sure. To ensure that every student emerges from K through 12 education with strong academic skills, social emotional wellness and intelligence, a sense of agency and civic responsibility, an awareness and appreciation of their multiple identities, and a broader set of competencies that equip them to be healthy, happy, contributing adults who can make a positive change in the world.
Awesome, thanks, Nia. The next slide. To move closer to this vision, this aspiration, our district teams have both learned and they've practiced using this framework that was designed by the National Equity Project to help districts identify their equity challenge by not just relying on having an equity lens. We know that that's insufficient in addressing the inequities that are pervasive within our districts, but it's also helping to sharpen their lens and their leadership to understand the complexity of the very problems that they were looking to solve by actually adopting a new approach, both in their leadership and within their district. And so we leveraged the liberatory design process, which was a partnership that was designed through the National Equity Project and the Stanford D School, to think about a different approach by which to address the complexity of the problems that districts had identified, specifically for the students who are most marginalized in their district or school. if you could take me to the next slide. Coupled with framework is also their specific leadership stance. And so we asked our district teams to think about, to adopt this approach. To what degree does their own leadership need to change as it relates to how they see the problems that they've identified, by not just using traditional data and metrics, but also engaging those students, those families, and even potentially those staff who are closest to the pain points within their districts that are perpetuating the inequities that they're looking to dismantle. And so we were quite proud to work alongside these 7 districts. We just completed year 1. We're now beginning year 2. I was proud to actually work with several districts, Chicago Public Schools being one of them, and even more so working closely with Peyton College Prep in Chicago. I was one of several coaches who were working alongside these districts. And Dr. Erica Bauer, who you're gonna hear from next, had already started doing some incredible work in the school and working with her leadership team to leverage equity audits as well as learning circles for adults to enrich this idea of, like, what does it mean to lead for equity, particularly given the challenge that they're experiencing so I was proud to actually work alongside Dr. and this team to help them leverage these specific frameworks to align the work they've done in the past and leverage this new approach to see, engage, and act in ways they hadn't necessarily seen before to get at the heart of their specific equity challenge, coupled with the work that Chicago Public Schools was doing through the Office of Equity. So I want to just provide some framework and certainly turn it over to Dr. Bauer and Nia.
Thanks so much, Alex. That was great. Hi, my name is Erica Bauer. Prior to working with the Bulls, for the Bulls, I spent the last 8 years in education and specifically focusing on how do we shift systems in a way that the students are the center of our decision-making processes. And I had the privilege of connecting with Dave of PERTS as well as Alex through the coalition or through the Midwest Network to help us, 1, identify our equity challenge, but 2, have some fresh eyes and some great tools that would help us make some progress on creating more equitable outcomes for our students. Next slide, please. So here's something I want you to reflect on. Which statement best describes your context? We make decisions that impact the student experience for our students. We make decisions that impact the student experience with our students. This was an aha moment for me as I was reflecting on my own experience as a student, right? And then turned educator. And so many things happened to me in the education system. And I often say from preschool to PhD, I was educated as a little white boy. And sadly, a lot hasn't changed when we look at our current system. And so here's some of I want us to reflect on this statement, not just for our own experiences as students, but specifically as educators. What is our goal? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And so 2 of the things that I really sought to institute at our school, or 2 of the things that we really wrestled with, is how do we ensure that the classroom space isn't solely dedicated to teaching content. A lot of times as educators, we think we are here to teach content, but the fact is we are teaching students, as my old principal used to say. And so if we're teaching students, then through the vehicle of content, then the students need to be central. And so 2 of the things that we really began to make explicit and create space in our classroom to address, one was who are our students? Based on their identities, coexisting identities. We have multiple identities, right? And so how do we ensure that we are acknowledging and addressing those by making space to get to know who our students are? And then how do they feel? And we started off using a tool called a mood meter that came out of Yale. And the mood meter was actually developed after the Sandy Hook shooting to help students navigate their emotional selves. And so we put this throughout the building, and despite the fact that students make fun of it sometimes, when it comes down to having challenging conversations, the students often rely on the language through the mood meter because that's what we've given them, right? So it's been a great success. And basically the mood meter allows students to plot where they are, which quadrant they find themselves in, based on their energy level and pleasantness. And so who they are and how they feel became central, and we began to really support teachers and encourage teachers, support teachers with tools and encouraging teachers to ensure that part of their time each day is dedicated to some aspect of student identity and student feeling. As a result, you had a better sense of what needed to happen in that day and if there are any changes that needed to occur. Thinking back to what Dave said about our current existing times, it cannot be business as usual. If you were teaching class last Tuesday when Mr. Blake was murdered in Kenosha, and you didn't do a temperature check for your students, and you didn't think through the fact that students with different identities may be impacted differently, then we're doing a disservice to our students, right? If anytime there's something happening and there's burden is placed on a specific segment of the population in your classroom, and we as adults don't address it, we are contributing to the inequitable outcomes in our classrooms, right? And so the equity, or the National Equity Project Midwest team really was instrumental in taking us further, one step further, and saying, who are the they that we need to prioritize? So we're talking about equity, not equality. And so for us, we had to get real about our equity challenge by looking at the gaps in outcomes. Who was performing differently, and what did they have in common? And sadly, though we are at, and Ania attends one of the top schools in the country, sadly, what we saw was that students, thanks, Dave. I just saw your chat. Sadly, what we saw is that our students of color were performing less well and were being underserved from our white students. And because that didn't align with our belief, we realized that the they would be our students of color, specifically our African-American students. And we began to say, how do we ensure that we are prioritizing the coexisting identities of our students of color as well as their feelings, right? And how do we ensure that that is then reflected in the classroom? And so when I reached out to Nia, and I said, because Nia is brilliant, and she knows. And so I reached out to Nia, and without her even having met Alex or Dave and understanding what this was about, I just told her the title of the session. And she responded to me and said, well, the best way to support students academically is to support students socio-emotionally. So I'm gonna ask Nia to unpack what that statement means.
Yeah, before I start, I'd like to thank Dr. Bauer for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. So yeah, what I meant by that really is that it's critical that teachers work to create meaningful relationships with their students. And speaking from personal experience, it is so much easier to do well in school when you feel as if your teachers would be there to listen to you and support you outside of school. And I've spoken about this with my peers many times, and truly all we want is our teachers to be more caring and understanding. And of course, there have been ways this has already happened for me. For example, the mood meter. So we would always plot, our point on the mood meter, figure out which quadrant aligned best with how we were feeling that day. Let's say a student was having a bad day or something negative had happened in their life and they had taken the time to share that experience. My AP US history teacher, she would always read through the responses on the mood meter. And if a student was having a bad day, she would be there with a hug or just be there to express that she was there for you and that if you needed anything at all, she'd be happy to help. And that meant so much to me personally because seeing how genuine she was with her kindness made me feel so much more comfortable with her. And that also in turn made me a lot more comfortable with asking for resources and extra assistance in class. And what do you know, I ended up getting an A in the class and a 5 on the AP US history exam. So, but yeah, and even then in other situations as well, I've had previous teachers freshman year, my geometry and civics teachers, they would also read through the responses. And when my Nona had passed away and I expressed how terrible I had been feeling, they really did reach out to me privately. They were like, we're here for you. They also reminded me that, I could go speak to my counselor or step out if I needed to, and that they would make changes to assignments if that was what I needed at the time. And that, again, made me feel so valued in the classroom because I saw that they cared about me, not just as their student that they happened to teach, but also as an individual who had her own things going on in her life. And then another thing that my teachers have done for me is they really made an effort to pay attention to student behavior and not to just rely on students to self-advocate for themselves. Because while I personally do agree with self-advocacy to some degree, I do realize that there are students who can get nervous or really uncomfortable with asking for help or want to just do it themselves and figure it out on their own. So having teachers pay attention to your behavior, to notice if you're distracted or down one day, or if you're not performing well in their class, that means the world. Again, my AP US history teacher, there was an assignment that I wasn't doing really well on, and she pulled me aside and was like, hey, I know you can do better than this. Can I help you in any way? And that made me feel just so appreciate that she really took the time to step out of her way and see if I needed help with anything. And yeah, of course, there are other things that I wish would happen more often. For example, just making efforts to learn about your students beyond the first week of school. Because sure, those teeny little questionnaires that you do during the first week are really fun sometimes, but when the questions stop there, when the teachers stop asking how you are, how you're doing, how your day was, if you need help with anything, when those questions stop, then there's a disconnect that exists for the rest of the year. And then if a teacher just out of the blue starts asking you questions, it feels very disingenuous and you don't really feel comfortable anymore with talking to them. So having my teachers constantly reach out to me just to show that they care and that they're passionate about what they're doing, that again makes a world of difference for students. And another thing as well is taking into the accounts of the feelings of the minority. So say you're having a class vote about something. Sure, it is super easy to just go off of how many hands are raised in the air. But sometimes when you don't allow students to have that opportunity to speak out and voice their opinions and feelings or how they would be affected by a decision, then they feel as if their voice does not matter to the teacher. They feel like they're not considerate. And so why even bother saying anything or expressing their true feelings? And so at least providing that space, like that space to say something, that again can make a world of difference. And that student can realize, oh, this teacher truly does care about what I have to say. But yeah, overall, just like making students feel comfortable is so important. But I also want to say that it is really difficult to expect your student to be comfortable telling you things when you haven't made that effort to begin with, when you haven't tried at all to make them feel comfortable with you. And so I really think consistency is key when it comes to that, and making them feel valued and like they're not an imposter at the school. Especially at Peyton, being a PWI, I've definitely had to experience that feeling of I'm the one Black girl in the classroom and I'm surrounded by my white peers and I don't feel like I belong. I don't feel like I can do well, like the school wasn't made for me, even though I have the potential to be here and succeed. And so that it really does make a world of difference when your teachers are kind and when they take time to show you that they really do believe in you, and it comes from a place of authenticity. But yeah, all this is to say, students really do perform better academically when they feel supported by their teachers socially, emotionally. And growing up, my mom would always tell me that your teachers can make a world of difference for you. And that is so true. Kind teachers that make their students feel comfortable, not only like perform better in school, but then they develop into confident, caring individuals who know how to pay it forward. And I think that in itself is amazing and something we should focus on.
If you all have a keynote space for this session, I think maybe Nia, you all need to invite her to speak. Abby just asked a great question about whether or not Nia has experienced that in remote learning. Nia, would you say that there are teachers that have exhibited any of this for you during, I know last year we transitioned to remote learning, and then school starts here next week, full remote learning. So I think the summer hopefully will bring better tactics than maybe you experienced. But is there anything that you can share with us that could be beneficial to the educators here about how you've experienced that caring and checking in an authentic way remotely?
Yeah, totally. When all the Black Lives Matter protests were happening in early June, right after the murder of George Floyd, a lot of my teachers had like this change happen within them. My choir teacher, she had asked me personally how I was doing. And when I told her that I was very upset and distressed by everything that was going on, she gave me the opportunity to elaborate on my feelings, speak my truth. And that meant so much to me that she really cared, but she also valued my story and my experiences, as well as my geometry teacher, or no, I think it was my algebra 2 teacher, I think, because this was this year. she reached out to me because she saw I hadn't finished an assignment that was due. And she asked if me having it unfinished was related to everything that was going on. And she didn't want to add any extra pressure or stress to me. So she really took the time to say, I'm here for you. And if there's anything you need, if you need an extension or to make this completely optional, I hear that, and I will completely do that for you if that's what you need. And that helped me so much. But I also want to say that changed my perspective of her a lot too. Because in the beginning of the year, I didn't feel like she really cared about me as a student. I didn't really think she was very passionate about working with her students to make sure that they were comfortable and, you know, grasping all the content. So seeing her take that time, that extra step to reach out to me really meant a lot to me, and it made me completely see her in a different light, because I saw, okay, she's really acknowledging how she may have failed as a teacher, and she's trying to start remedying that. And again, that was amazing for me. I definitely think I got a lot of support then.
Thanks, Nia. That's really helpful and really insightful. And someone had shared in the chat that there are resources, great online resources. And yes, there are. Remote learning is going to, we're going to be facing a challenge, remote learning. But Nia, thank you so much for saying that it is possible and there are things that we can do in this space. Next slide, please. So briefly, I'm going to talk about some of the things I employed while I was at Nia School, Walter Payton. And there's nothing really unique about these things. I think what's key, and I still use these techniques in my current job with the Bulls, is what's key is employing strategies that are shifting the power, right? As adults in a school setting, we inherently have the power. When you employ strategies that shift the power, and you do it in a way to shift the power, that's when you're beginning to create a system where you're making decisions with your students versus for them. For interviews, we've had, so one example of an interview, I invited a student who was struggling to do a Q&A with me, and in the room were his teachers, his parents, and his counselor. So I worked with his counselor to create this. The way we set the stage was that none of the adults were permitted to talk during that time. So the student had the floor. He and I rehearsed and practiced the questions I would be asking. And the purpose of us gathering for that interview was to better understand the ways in which he was struggling to perform well in the class. And then after he was done being interviewed, the teachers began to share and the parents began to share about what they learned and what they can do for next steps. But again, setting the stage so that the student has the power in that situation, especially when you're in a room full of adults. Focus groups. We had a challenge where we were noticing that students who had done well enough to take a push, such as Nia, specifically students of color, we noticed a number of students were opting to not take AP US history. We wanted to understand why. So I gave the students a camera. I was gonna sit in the room, but then my AP at the time said, we don't need to be in the room. Best idea ever. Gave the students the camera and said, answer this one question on camera. Why are you all not taking the class? They gave the camera back. Students had a blast. We used, knowing that we were going to use this as a teaching tool to better understand why these students weren't taking a class that they were eligible to take. And some of the insights that we learned actually ended up going to the AP board, because part of it is they felt that the content didn't reflect their identities. And one student, to quote, said, I want to learn about how, an African-American female student said, I want to first learn about how I was a king or a queen before I'm learning how I was enslaved. And so that was some powerful feedback to better understand why students weren't taking the class. Observations, that's really for the adults. Alex actually came to Payton and conducted observations with us just to see what patterns, and really is helpful for understanding and identifying implicit bias. And so we would go into classes, notice themes, and then we had a notation device to do that with. So observations, it would be ideal to have students partake in observations, but not if they're gonna miss out on class time. So that was something that we did. And then finally, story circles. A few of our teachers would employ this when they were trying to understand maybe why students didn't perform well on an assessment, or I know someone earlier in the chat referenced having exit slips. It could be a type of exit slip, or maybe a reflection tool that you use at the end of the quarter, where you give the students a prompt and then you allow them to share their stories or their narrative in relation to that prompt without interruption. And then finally, surveys. We were fortunate enough through our partnership with NEP, National Equity Project, to employ Elevate, the tool that Dave developed with his team of people, and we decided to administer that survey throughout the school for each class. Two reasons. One, the students requested it. Specifically, our Student Government Association said, we want to provide feedback. And they got wind that this also happens in college. And so they're like, some of them said, you're so quick to tell us about you're preparing us for college. Well, part of college is giving feedback to our professors, and they're right. So we were able to utilize the tool. And the second reason is that making surveys is challenging. People go to school to do this work. A number of teachers develop their own surveys, and sometimes they're just not good. And there's no shade. It's because people go to school to figure out how to do this. And so it was nice to have a validated measure that we can employ throughout the school that gave us the data, that really did all the heavy lifting. And surveys across course teams, specifically when you're aligned, allows for collaboration. A lot of times teachers are administering surveys in a vacuum, and then that forces you to rely on yourself for being able to identify everything that you need to fix. It's not really possible. However, when you can do it within a course team, and you can say, hey, my marking is lower in this than you, what are you doing differently? Then we are really enhancing our system and enhancing our community through collaboration. And so those are some of the things that we've done at Peyton. They're readily available and very accessible, but ultimately, the goal is, how do you put people like Nia at the center and on stage to share, not to do your work, because sometimes that happens too, not to do the work that we as adults should be doing, but to illuminate the experiences and the outcomes of the kind of education that we're administering. And with that, I will turn it back over to Dave.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. Yeah, that was really wonderful. I really appreciate you speaking from the heart about your own experiences like that. And Alex and Erica, so glad to have had you as co-presenters. So yes, if we could just go to the next slide. Yeah, I just wanted to end by pointing you all to links to some of the resources that free resources that we've been discussing today. You can find the tool that we were talking about at perts.net/elevate. The actual survey measures that we were chatting about can be found at perts.net/elevate/measures, or if you just go to Elevate, there's a link to those resources there. You can also go to equitablelearning.org to find lots of different suggestions and practices and kind of links to different kinds of tools and resources for creating more equitable learning environments. And again, I want to emphasize all these resources are free, and that's thanks to the Rakes Foundation, the Overdeck Foundation, and the Gates Foundation, and to amazing educators and students who I've had the honor of working with, like those who co-presented with me today. So just really honored and humbled to have gotten to speak with you all. And yeah, and at this point, I'd love to just turn it over and see if anyone has any questions.
Great. Thank you all. Everyone, please, if you have questions for our panelists, you're welcome to post them in the chat box. I saw a couple questions that I think it might be helpful to go over while everybody's getting their questions into the chat box. First, maybe I'll throw it back to Nia. I saw a question for you. It said, have you experienced these things effectively in the universe of remote learning, or anything that teachers have done in distance learning that has really built safety and relationships?
Yeah, I think outside of like everything that happened around the Black Lives Matter protests, I think there were times where we would be able to share our feelings or just kind of give a word about where we were at. And I think that really helped, just knowing that they were just looking out for us in that regard, just to make sure that we were all okay. But again, all those like private emails and things like that, making sure that your students were feeling, you know, comfortable and, you know, adjusting well, because remote learning is new for all of us. I think that really, really helped having that resources, and, you know, just seeing that those teachers were really, really trying to do it together, really.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Again, everyone is encouraged to post questions in the chat box, keep them coming. I saw a few things a little bit earlier in the session. Maybe I'll throw it to you, Dave. There are more comments, but I wonder if you want to reflect on them. One was around the timing of feedback and the place for reflection. Anything about the order of things and perhaps inserting an opportunity for reflection in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think reflection is incredibly important. You know, just getting the data and then not thinking about it, not talking to students about it, that's not going to change anything, right? I think it's really essential if we take the time to get, you know, we really think of the student survey as really being kind of an opening to a conversation. It's confidential, which I think is really important because, like Nia said, a lot of students don't feel comfortable just volunteering information. So I think it really signals care to students that you're asking in the first place. The fact that it's confidential makes it easier for them to be honest. And then the kinds of questions really kind of get at different aspects of student experience, these different learning conditions that we know are really important, but that students might not think to themselves to spontaneously volunteer, oh, I'm not getting enough of this, I'm not getting enough of that. So really what we try to do is to synthesize from research. These are different kinds of things that we know are really important. And we want to make it really easy, you know, like in 5 to 10 minutes for teachers to get that feedback from their students in a confidential way. But then ideally what they should do at that point is do some reflection on that. Talk with their colleagues about it. Like Erica was saying, ideally teachers work in teams to do this kind of work together. And then absolutely, and then to you know, once they've done that, to talk with their students about it, right? To engage in further and follow-up conversations, you know, reach out to individual students, do a little focus group, do a discussion, go dig deeper. Once you kind of know where you stand on these things from a quantitative standpoint, then digging in, it can be really helpful. And yeah, and I think reflection and, you know, and really being open and vulnerable with oneself and one's students is, yeah, I mean, frankly, it's essential. It's nothing's going to change unless we reflect, unless we really allow ourselves to be open and vulnerable.
Excellent. Thank you. I see one for you, Dr. Bauer. It says, once you collected all of that incredibly rich data from interviews, et cetera, I love that you handed the camera over to students, but what were the next steps and who was involved?
Great question. And so the students returned the camera, and they had actually had a little music video surprise recorded in there as well. Thanks for that. So what I did is I spoke with the students about next steps, because I think, to Dave's point, I've learned the hard way about what happens when you collect so much data and you don't have a plan for it. And so so now I collect it and we have a plan for before the collection. So the plan was to show it to our faculty more broadly, right? Because the goal is never to shame the teachers. We collected it towards course programming time at the end of the school year. So we gave the video to the teachers and then allowed the teachers to present coming back to the fall, which would have been last fall, to talk about changes they plan to make in their curriculum. And they shared in a way that then other teachers could learn, maybe ways that they could reflect. It was challenging because it's an AP course, right? And so they really had to figure out what was possible. And then we shared the data we shared the video with the people who run the AP board at our district. And I don't know whatever happened beyond conversations there, but at least the students were able to speak. And then also provided this, Dr. Jackson, who leads CPS, about how to teach or how to share this with other school leaders. So lots of learning, but letting the students have a say in what you do with it is important, so they don't feel like you're exploiting their stories.
Excellent, excellent. I see so many more about timing, about people of color in curriculum. That would be great. Let me just end with this last question before we break for time. It says, and I think many of you can respond to this, curious what you might be learning about engaging with school and district leaders in this type of work, especially those who seem resistant, defensive, or unaware. Who'd like to tackle that?
I'll add a short perspective. I think in doing this type of systems work, it's generally never about a teacher or a small group of teachers, right? It is about the entire system, whether it be a school or a district. I think the conditions have to be readied by the adults so that the adults are prepared to authentically engage students in this type of power sharing partnership that gets at the heart of what they're experiencing as it relates to the change that we want to see in the system. And it can't go without the other. And I think there's one specific aspect of the co-pilot Elevate that wasn't talked about today is that the data that the teacher gets, it is supposed to empower that teacher to then engage students, not just engage the teacher herself or other teachers. It's to actually be in partnership with the students about what they're experiencing so they can co-construct the type of change that they both want to see in the classroom that works for all kids, particularly for the kids who are not experiencing the type of environment that most kids are. That type of power sharing and co-construction, I think, is a game changer when you think about meeting the various needs of kids authentically and doing it in a way that addresses systems, not just an individual.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. Oh gosh, I feel like I've learned so much, and this has been so incredible and insightful. I just really want to say thank you to all of our guests. And you know what, I would love to encourage all of our participants to maybe type into the chat box your number one takeaway from today's conversation. I'd just love to show our guests some appreciation. So thank you again, Dave, Erica, Alex, and Nia for making this such an accessible session and for lifting up this critical aspect of our work. As we wrap up, I want to very quickly share a little bit more about our All Fall webinar series. These are a list of just a few of the sessions that we have planned for the month of September. And as I mentioned, we have plenty more coming. So I encourage you again to please head to our website, click on Learn and Network, learn all about them, sign up, and please also save October 26th through 28th for our virtual and complimentary symposium. Our team is working really hard to design a very awesome experience for you. So I hope that you will join us. If you will also head to our website, click on symposium, you'll see a little snippet of what we have planned for you. So please plan to be there. And that's it for us today. Again, we will make this recording available to everyone who has registered and joined us. Thank you to everyone who attended, who really dug in and asked great questions and really engaged. And I hope to see you on tomorrow's webinar and Thursdays. So thank you, everybody. Be well. Bye-bye.